Wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone. My name is Christine Chen, Executive Director and founder of Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote, APIAVote. So welcome to our press briefing on the Asian American Voter Survey. Thank you, everyone, for all being here today. Since 2012, the Asian American Voter Survey has stood as a preeminent resource for understanding the political landscape of the fastest growing segment of the American electorate. This comprehensive multilingual survey has consistently provided invaluable insights into the Asian American voting population, a diverse coalition comprising various ethnicities, languages, and cultural backgrounds. Our survey explores critical aspects of Asian American political engagement, including presidential candidate favorability, top issues influencing voting decisions, political identification and leanings, voter engagement and outreach, support for key policy decisions. Over the years, this survey has become an essential resource for media, pollsters, corporations, and political campaigns. It fills a crucial gap in our understanding of Asian American political views and attitudes, offers a nuanced picture of this complex and influential voter bloc. As we prepare to share our latest findings, it's important to note that this survey is a public service made possible through the generous support of funders. The data we collect and analyze helps communicate the voting impact of our communities and informs national conversations about political participation and representation. In today's briefing, we'll delve into our most recent results, exploring emerging trends and their potential implications for the upcoming elections. At this time, I'd like to go ahead and toss it over to Karthik Ramakrishnan.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you all for joining us. I will say a little bit about the background for this study and why it is so important. As Christine mentioned, Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial group in the United States and the fastest growing electorate. And we saw record gains in voter turnout during the 2018 midterm elections, as well as the 2020 presidential election. We're also fast growing in many battleground states that are important not only for the presidential race, but also for control of the Senate and the House. I'm Karthik Ramakrishnan. I'm Executive Director and founder of AAPI Data, and we've been partnering with APIAVote and AAJC on these surveys for many years. Key findings are on voter intent, outreach and party identification, and on various policy issues. When it comes to voter intent, we see that 90% of Asian American registered voters say they plan to vote. While this might seem high, it is lower than what we saw in 2020 and 2016. About 2/3 say that they are absolutely certain that they will vote this year, and even that is lower than in prior years, and especially so among young people. So turnout and motivation is going to be an important aspect of the election this year. Other key findings are that even though you have about 90% of registered voters say that they plan to vote, 42% of them say that they have not been contacted by either party. There's been more contact by Democrats than by Republicans, which we'll show later. In terms of presidential favorability, over half of Asian American voters view Joe Biden very favorably or somewhat favorably, while just over 1/3 say the same for Donald Trump. If the election were held today, Biden does better than Trump among Asian American registered voters, but about 1 in 4, nearly 1 in 4, 23%, say that they would either vote for a third-party candidate or are undecided or refuse to answer. You see that Joe Biden sees the biggest drop in vote share from 2020, whereas Donald Trump has a marginal gain. And there's not much difference when it comes to the Senate race and the House race, indicating that Biden is underperforming compared to a generic ballot for the US Senate and for the US House. In terms of policy priorities, I'll show some of these slides, but I'll zip through them. We'll have these slides available for download at the APIAVote website, as well as the AAPI Data website. See a bunch of issues ranked in terms of their order of importance. Economy and inflation is very high, but so too is healthcare and crime and education. those are not distinguishable in terms of the survey's margin of error. You also see Social Security and Medicare and the cost of housing among the top issues. Asian American voters believe that the Democratic Party is doing a better job on issues like abortion, healthcare, racism, and gun control. On the other hand, they believe that the Republican Party is doing a better job on matters like national security, immigration, inflation, and crime. We also asked a question, what issues might be enough to get them to the polls regardless of how they feel about any particular candidate? If, for example, they are not particularly inspired by either of the presidential candidates, what kinds of issues could get them to the polls? We see that the economy is still number one, right, with jobs in the economy and inflation. They see healthcare, Social Security, and Medicare, so care-related issues, followed by crime, cost of housing, gun control, national security, immigration, and education. All of these broke the 70% mark. We have important aspects of policy priorities that other panelists will speak to. So I'm just going to zip through these. And then finally, most Asian American voters get their news or news headlines from television, followed by print and digital sites, and YouTube. Facebook and other sources also matter. And even though 3 in 4 Asian American voters get most of their news from English language sources exclusively, about a quarter get it either exclusively in an Asian language or in a mix of English and Asian languages. So I'll say a little bit about the survey's methodology and turn it back to Christine Chen. In terms of our methods, we had 2,479 Asian American registered voters, with the 6th largest group that account for the vast majority of Asian American registered voters. We had language assistants in Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese that account for the populations in this sample that have relatively low English proficiency. We weighted the data by Asian ethnicity as it intersects with state of residence, as well as with key demographic factors like age, education, gender, and nativity. We also had an adjustment for the party distribution of registered voters to account for any differential response based on the partisanship of the sample. You see the margins of error on the right. These account for not just sample size, but the design effect, meaning the weighting scheme that we applied introduces additional error into the estimates. And so this is a truer estimate of what the margin of error would be on any particular question. So with that, I'll turn it back to Christine, who will present on some important findings on civic engagement.
Great. Thank you, Karthik. So let's go ahead and get started in regards to our voting plans. We're going to dive in. So 90% of Asian American voters say they plan to vote for the president, Congress, and other offices this November. Although percentage is high, it's slightly lower compared to 93% in 2020 and 94% in 2016. Even with a slight decrease from previous years, it's still a remarkably high figure because our turnout potential is high. In the next slide, you'll see is that 68% this year say that they are absolutely certain that they will vote. This is a decrease from 2020 when 82% said that they were absolutely certain. This may be due to multiple factors, including not enough meaningful outreach into our communities, as well as dis and misinformation expanding on social media. In our next slide, in regards to voting plans and methods, 46% of Asian Americans voters prefer voting by mail or dropping their ballot off instead of voting in person on election day. Higher number vote by mail than any other racial group. In 2022, we know that 73% of Asian American electorate voted by mail or opted for early voting. So what this means is that campaigns should take note of this and engage us early on in order to capture the large percentage of our communities that vote early. In our next slide, we have about party identification without independent leaners. 42% of Asian American voters identify as Democrat, 22% Republican, while 31% stated that they were independent. This is something that we've been seeing since 2022. The high percentage of independents indicate a significant group that could be swayed by effective outreach and messaging. Now, I want to focus on Chinese voters who had surveyed had the biggest share who identify as independent at 38%, although that is smaller than in 2022 when 47% identified themselves as independent. Also, Vietnamese voters surveyed had the biggest share who identify as Republicans at 33%. That's consistent with the share in 2022 at 31%. But the share of Vietnamese voters who now identify as Democrats increased to 37% from 23% in 2022. Based on previous surveys and what we've seen, there's little evidence to indicate that Asian American voters are moving to the right, contrary to recent narratives that have been circulating. But there is evidence that a large share of Asian American voters are up for grabs. This diversity also suggests that Asian American voters are not a monolithic bloc and have varied political views. Let's go ahead and look at party identification. When you add independent leaners, those who lean towards either the Democratic or Republican Party, you see a larger preference for the Democratic Party. Asian American voters at 51% Democrats, 19% independents, and 28% Republican. Now it goes once again into outreach. For the Democratic Party, Asian American voters plan to vote in high numbers. They plan to do it early, and there is a share who are independent. However, in terms of outreach, there is much to improve. 50% of Asian American voters say they have not been contacted by the Democratic Party, the same percentage who said the same in 2020 at 50%. Now, note 54% of Korean voters have not been contacted by Democrats, 55% of Filipino voters, and then we also see that older Asian American voters are less likely to be contacted. 57% said that they were not contacted by Democrats. Let's go over to the Republican Party. 57% of Asian American voters say that they have not been contacted by the Republican Party. In 2020, 58% said that they had not been contacted by the Republicans. And among certain ethnicities, the share is even higher. 65% of Korean voters and then 61% of Filipino and Chinese voters have not been contacted. So in this, it's all about major party outreach. So although outreach has improved since 2016, we see a flattening now since 2020. This is especially concerning, especially when you consider the considerable growth of the API electorate in many of these key battleground states. This is a missed opportunity given that 90% plan to vote. This lack of engagement is essentially suppressing turnout among a group of high voting intentions. When you combine what you see with Democrat and Republican outreach, you see the bigger picture and the problem in terms of engagement with this electorate. In that, it's a full 42% of Asian American voters say they have not been contacted by either the Democrats or the Republicans. Once again, half of Korean voters have been contacted by no one. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Karthik.
Thank you, Christine. So let me, I am running the slides, folks. So thank you for your patience. So I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into vote choice, as well as the important issues that are animating the Asian American electorate this year. First, with respect to vote choice, we ask, thinking about the upcoming November election for president, if the election were held today, would you be inclined to vote for Joe Biden, Donald Trump, or some other candidate? We see that Biden is at 46%, Trump at 31%, 5% for someone else, and then 18% don't know, refused. You see, generally speaking, Biden over Trump for all Asian American groups, except for Vietnamese Americans, where it is a statistical tie, given the survey's margin of error. Now, we do have change over time for each of the major party candidates. We see that Biden's decline overall is 8 percentage points, but the drop among Indian Americans is the most dramatic. We see a nearly 20% drop among Indian Americans. In the results that you can find on our website, you see that the biggest beneficiary, the biggest gain is actually among those who say don't know, as well as those supporting other candidates. Donald Trump does not gain significantly among Indian Americans, which I'll show on the next slide. We also see significant declines for Japanese Americans at 11 percentage points, as well as for Filipino Americans at 12 percentage points. See a marginal increase among Vietnamese Americans from 36 to 40%, although again, that's within the margin of error for that subgroup. For Donald Trump, we see a decline that is within that is outside of the margin of error for Vietnamese Americans. So that looks like a real decline in support between 2020 and 2024. For all other groups, any kind of movement is relatively small and within the survey's margin of error for that particular group. Favorability, we see that Joe Biden's favorability has declined since 2020, but still remains higher than for Donald Trump, who we'll show in the next slide. All of these slides that we're presenting today are disaggregated by ethnicity, and in some cases, we'll have breakdowns by age. You will find all of these results in the crosstabs on our website at AAPIData.com. So I'll just go through these slides relatively quickly in the interest of time. Note that Donald Trump's unfavorability is very high. It's 62% when you add the somewhat unfavorable and very unfavorable. So even if Joe Biden's favorability has declined since 2020, Trump's unfavorability remains very high and presents a ceiling for any gains that he might potentially make, although the declining favorability for Biden might relate to voter enthusiasm and voter turnout come November. We also asked questions about favorability for Kamala Harris, as well as for Nikki Haley, with some speculation that perhaps she might be a vice presidential candidate, and as arguably the most prominent Asian American candidate on the Republican side this year. We see that Harris's favorability is very similar to Biden's, indicating that, and this too has declined since 2020, indicating that it's more about the Biden-Harris administration rather than thinking of these two candidates separately. Importantly, the survey was conducted in April and May before the first presidential debate in late June. Congressional election, we see 50% for Democrat, 30% for Republicans, 6% for some other party, and then 13% don't know, refuse. This is a generic Senate ballot, and this is the way that the question was asked among those respondents living in states with Senate elections. In terms of the US House, we see a similar kind of a split, 51% Democrat, 30% Republican. In terms of key issues that are animating the electorate, jobs in the economy, healthcare, inflation are at the top, but not far behind. It all depends on if you're just looking at extremely important or very important. You also see issues like crime and education, followed by Social Security and Medicare, and the list of other issues. There are important differences in how Asian Americans evaluate the parties on these issues. And by the way, we have a more detailed set of slides on our website as well that you can look at in terms of the ethnic breakdowns for each of those issues. Generally speaking, they see the Democratic Party as having a strong advantage on issues like abortion or reproductive rights, healthcare, racism and racial discrimination, gun control, environment, as well as Social Security and Medicare. Education also is at the top there. So these are all issues where Democrats enjoy an advantage among Asian American registered voters. On the other hand, when it comes to issues like immigration, jobs in the economy, and national security, inflation, these are issues where the Republican Party enjoys an advantage. So what we will likely see is each party emphasizing their strength on these particular issues in terms of informing vote choice as well as turnout in November. We also asked a few questions about voter concerns, including unexpected medical expenses and other concerns. So when it comes to unexpected medical expenses, we see that 37%, so over a third, very often or somewhat often worry about not being able to cover an unexpected medical expense. You see over 40%, so 43% worry very often or somewhat often about not being able to retire when they want for financial reasons. As a reminder, all of this data is weighted by various factors, including age. So it is telling that this is not just a concern among older Asian American voters. Finally, in terms of policy perspectives, consistent with past results, we see that Asian Americans score very high in terms of their support for environmental protection. The way we asked the question this time around was Congress and the president should pass stronger legislation to reduce the effects of climate change. And we see 69% agreeing strongly or agreeing somewhat. Very little support, in fact, opposition to states and local governments or school boards banning books and lessons about racism in American schools. We see strong support consistent with many years of survey research by the Asian American Voter Survey, as well as other surveys by APIA Data. Very strong support for stricter gun laws in the United States. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Yang. But before I do, I also want to note that Janelle Wong, who is my research partner on this effort, is with us and can answer any questions in the Q&A. But I'll turn it over to John Yang, who's the president and executive director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC.
Great. Thank you very much, Karthik. And yes, I'm John Yang. I'm the president and executive director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, based in Washington, D.C. Our organization's mission is to advance the civil and human rights of Asian Americans and to promote a fair and equitable society for all. And we are honored to continue partnering with APIAVote, API Data, as well as AARP on these voter surveys, because these are critically important. You know, voting is a right in our country, and protecting that right to vote, especially the right to vote for new citizens, is a central mission for our organizations. And part of that means understanding what matters to our community and how we need to relate to them. Toward that end, I will use this as an opportunity to make sure that everyone knows about resources that all of our organizations provide. One important one is a resource that APIAVote and AAJC partner together on, which is called 888 API Vote. So for those that have any questions about voting, if they need assistance, that is a multilingual hotline that we provide in multiple Asian languages for anyone that has questions, that they can go to that hotline and make sure that they know how they can vote, what they need to vote, where to vote. So when I look at this survey, I try to sort of, the part of this, when we all looked at the data, so for me, it was also about understanding the data a little bit more in detail. And so what I'm going to do is give you a little bit of context on some of the things that jumped out at me when we're talking about the data. So when I think about this, some of the key insights that I think about, and Karthik, thank you, okay. So the certain things that jumped out at me include immigration, education, and language access. Particularly immigration around family-based immigration, particularly around education in terms of inclusive education, and particularly around language access at the polls. One thing to remember for our community and for those people that are learning about our community is about 30% of our community is limited English proficient. In other words, the English level is not at a level that they're completely comfortable with, right? About 1 in 4, there's a number of our community members that speak a different language at home. So you all know this, right? Even for those that are fluent in English, when you go to the ballot box and you're trying to navigate that ballot, especially when there's referendas and ballot initiatives, it can become confusing. Just imagine what that's like if you have a ballot that is only in English, even though you're in a jurisdiction that has a high percentage of Asian language speakers, or even if you're not in that jurisdiction, how you navigate it. So having that assistance is important to our community. Another thing to recognize is how we get our news. You know, the fact that yes, we get it from TV, yes, we get it from English sources, but that a significant portion of our community gets it in language on YouTube, on Facebook, on all sorts of social media platforms. And what that means for ensuring that we do not have misinformation, disinformation. And the other aspect that I would flag is that certainly with respect to hate incidents, harassment, discrimination of the Asian American community, that has not abated since COVID-19. We saw a particular spike at that time for understandable reasons, but that has not abated. Part of that is because there's this continued tension between the United States and the Chinese government. Now, that tension is real. A lot of that has real world aspects to it. But what we have also seen is a backlash against the Asian American community in framing us as potential spies, framing us as potential enemies. So just to refresh in terms of what the data look like with respect to what how Asian Americans thought about issues, and this is on the next slide, is the top of this slide, jobs and the economy, inflation, healthcare, social security, crime, housing. All of these things are, frankly, if you look at national surveys of all Americans, not just Asian Americans, you would find that those resonate. The interesting things to me, in particular, that I would point out is around immigration and education, because these are areas that rank a little bit higher when it comes to the Asian American community than other communities. So if we look specifically at immigration as an example, on immigration, about 71% of our population would say that this would be a motivating factor to get people out to the polls on election day, right? So if you are an elected official or someone that is seeking election, understanding that that is an important issue will resonate in terms of how you frame the issues. And so that is actually the next slide. Sorry, and actually I could probably take this over if, okay. Right, and you will see that about 66% of our population would agree or strongly or agree somewhat. So this diving into the specifics about this, one particular issue that is of importance to AAJC is around what's called family-based immigration. Traditionally, about 60% of the Asian American population has immigrated to the United States through family-based visas. And so as you would probably be unsurprised to see, 66% of our community would say that sponsoring family members to get visas to immigrate into the United States is a high-ranking priority. If you look at the breakouts, it's interesting to note that among Filipino Americans, this resonates 75% support. Among Chinese Americans, it's the lowest at 45%, although you would note that neither agree nor disagree for Chinese Americans is 25%, and the opposition is only about 15%. In some ways, this makes sense. If you look at the wait times for Filipino Americans in particular, when it comes to family visas, they can extend up to 20 years. So that makes sense that it would resonate with that community. But frankly, the wait times for Chinese Americans, Indian Americans are also similarly pretty long. And so part of this might be sort of making sure people understand what the family-based system is. But the bottom line is that clearly this is an issue that resonates. This is an issue for which the Asian American community as a whole supports. The next issue that I want to dive a little bit closely into is around education, and particularly around what we would call inclusive history. This notion that our history books, our K through 12 curricula, should include lessons on Asian American history and include lessons on other non-white groups. So this question was framed on both Asian American history and other non-white groups. Again, you will see that 74% of our population, the Asian American population, agreed with the sentiment, and only 18% disagreed with it. And you can see the breakouts again in terms of within the disaggregated data about who would support, who would not support. And frankly, here you see that the differences aren't huge. On one level, Filipino Americans and Vietnamese Americans rank a little bit higher at 80% and 79%. But that is not, in some ways, statistically that different than Indian Americans and Chinese Americans, which are at 68 and 69%, respectively. To answer a question that I see in the chat, I believe that we did not do enough oversampling to break this out by states or by geography. So that might be an interesting study to do in the future. And then if we were to take a further look at this, if we wanted to focus in on Asian American history and ask a question just about focusing in on Asian American history, on one hand, I would note that the differences aren't that great. Because the prior question, when it said Asian American and other non-white history, the percentage that agreed strongly or agreed somewhat was at 74%. Here, when we just focus on Asian American history, the percentage increases slightly to 77%. What I find refreshing about this is that Asian Americans are not necessarily looking at this only in a self-centered manner, only looking at Asian American history, but rather that there's some level of agreement that all forms of history need to be told from a non-white perspective. So that is sort of an interesting finding that we hadn't really focused on before. The last piece when it comes to education would be on what we would call educational access and making sure that all communities had better access to educational opportunities. And here, this was quite resounding that Asian Americans supported this by a level of 83%, with only 8% in opposition. And part of why we have consistently polled this question, sometimes using different variations, because as we all know, when it comes to that specific narrow aspect that sometimes people refer to as affirmative action, there is this misperception that Asian Americans are very deeply split on this issue. In prior years, when we have polled on that question specifically around affirmative action, Asian Americans largely supported the community. And so in that context, it is refreshing to see that 83% still support inclusive education. I believe that is the last of my slides. Yes. Wait, is this? Oh, okay. So very quickly, with respect to information sources and languages, with respect to translations, people feel that this is very, very important. In terms of making sure that Asian Americans have access to translations, etc. For those that do not speak English or English very well. So this is 75%. Again, you see some variation based on proficiency rates among the subgroups. With respect to information sources, as I mentioned before, about a quarter of Asian Americans are looking at news in other media. So, and you could see the breakout here with respect to a preponderance still on television, print, and news media, but then a significant amount on YouTube, Facebook, and other groups. And then lastly, with respect to hate crimes, harassment, and discrimination, as I mentioned, this is still an area of significant interest to our community with respect to the fact that after COVID, we've seen this increase, and that hasn't abated. So if you look at the statistics, about 68% of our community believes that or worries about these issues, and it's about 1 in 3 of our community would consider this an often or very often issue for them. Again, when you look at the breakouts, it makes some sense to me because sort of Indian Americans, part of the issue there is how it oftentimes is also conflated more generally with the Memza community, and sort of whether it's Sikh Americans or South Asian Americans. Generally, we've seen a little bit of a rise with respect to Chinese Americans because of, as I have mentioned, the anti-China rhetoric that we have seen before. Great. And
Thank
with that,
you.
I think I will turn it over to Daphne to go into the
Great.
next section.
Thank you so much, John. Good afternoon. I'm Daphne Kwok. I'm Vice President, AARP, Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and I have the honor of working on behalf of the AAPI audience. And we have had a long-standing collaboration with APIAVote, AAPI Data, and AAJC as well. At AARP, our mission is to make sure that the most important issues facing older adults get the attention and action they deserve. We know that voters age 50 plus are the largest, most powerful voting bloc in the country. They consistently show up at the polls, and we anticipate that this year will be no different. In the 2020 presidential election, the share of voters age 50 plus was nearly 3 times that of voters under 30, 53% to 18%. Among AAPI voters age 50 and older, 9 in 10 say they plan to vote in 2024, according to this latest AAVS survey. Older Asian American voters want to see politicians address their day-to-day challenges, like caring for their loved ones and protecting their hard-earned Social Security. According to the survey, 1 in 4 Asian American voters are currently providing care to an older or ill adult or someone with a disability. Family caregiving impacts Asian American voters of all generations, especially among 18 to 34 and 35 to 49-year-olds.
I
As
think
a
we're having problems with the slides. Real quick, just want to make sure that the slides are going. There you go.
Oh, thank you. As a backbone of our long-term care system, family caregivers help with everything from buying groceries to managing medications to bathing and dressing, often putting their finances and jobs at risk. Yet they don't get the support they need, and it's time to change that. 70% of Asian American voters agree that Congress and the president should pass stronger legislation to support family caregivers. Both parties have a big opportunity to win these voters. Caregivers can make the difference in a close election. Asian American voters are also concerned about Social Security and Medicare being protected. And 79% say candidates' positions on Social Security and Medicare will be an extremely or very important issue in determining their vote. Americans work hard and pay into Social Security. It's their money. For 2/3 of Asian Americans, Social Security is or will be a source of their income for their family. 85% of Asian American voters agree that Congress and the president should make sure workers get the Social Security benefits they paid into and earned. As the group that will be the deciders of this election, candidates must address the issues that matter to older adults and their families. That not only entails supporting family caregivers and protecting Social Security and Medicare, but also addressing higher inflation, prices rising higher than wages, and retirement savings in crisis. AARP is also working to make sure AAPIs have trusted information on where, when, and how to vote in the 2024 elections. You can learn more at aarp.org/vote. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks. So Christine's back to you, and it's our Q&A portion of the session.
Great. Yes, so just as a reminder, if you could go ahead and place your questions here in the Q&A part. So this one, have there been studies or surveys done on other Asian Americans, Southeast Asians, considering the API community has the largest disparities? How does the Hmong community being classified as East Asians in the recent census impact these surveys and the data being collected and interpreted?
Yes, that's a good question. And I'll say, as API Data, in fact, all of the organizations on this call are very committed to disaggregating the data as much as possible. In the past, and when it comes to serving Asian American and even Pacific Islander voters, we don't have a Pacific Islander sample here. It often comes down to a matter of cost. And I want to credit APIAVote in particular for fundraising ambitiously for this survey, but we could not raise enough funds to get additional groups, including Hmong and other Southeast Asian groups and Pacific Islander groups. But that is a commitment that we have. What we have seen in prior surveys that have included Hmong, and these are surveys that Janelle Wong and I have done, is they tend to be Democratic leaning, and they tend to be even more sensitive to questions of economic security. So absent that data, but given what we have seen in prior surveys, we can make an educated guess that the Hmong American population would be Democratic leaning, as they have been when we've seen them in prior surveys. and that economic security issues remain high among that group.
So here's a question about, I think this is more for John. How does the survey differentiate those who say they read print news or digital newspaper sites and Asian print or digital media sites?
I don't know if John could answer that question. I think this is something that Janelle and I will need to answer on a methodology side. And but then I think, John, I think from a, from how it affects the populations that you advocate for and serve, I think we can go to that. But, we, in the context of a survey, it's importantly, this survey was not only online, also done by telephone. It was about a 50-50 split. And that's really challenging to do, and to make sure that we don't lose respondents because of respondent fatigue. So the way we asked these questions were succinct and efficient. So we are not able to make some of those nuanced differentiations that people might wish to understand in terms of what, if someone either checks off the box or on a phone call, on a phone interview, says that they follow these digital websites, it's very possible that those same news organizations have other ways of informing their audiences as well.
I think what I would add
Go ahead.
it is just simply part of the reason for this survey is to make sure people understood where Asian Americans were consuming their media. And making sure that policymakers understood this. So if they're trying to reach out to our communities, yes, regular print media and radio and television is one source and is a dominant source, but that these other alternative sources are just as can be just as important, especially in language. Also, it's important to document the fact that we are going to these alternate sites, to recognize where misinformation, disinformation may proliferate, so that we can also make sure that policymakers understand that these sources really do matter to our community, and getting it right on these platforms really do matter.
We're going to go to Sunita, who has a question. Sunita, you're unmuted.
I have a question for Daphne. Given the focus on Biden.
Sorry, you know what? Daphne actually had to leave, so she wasn't able to. So if you want to put your question in here, we'll be sure to actually relay that to her, as well as Madison Daniels, who is their senior advisor of external relations at AARP, and they could go ahead and get back to you. Apologies, Daphne had to get off.
Yeah, and no, but I'll just say, but looking at Sunita's question in the Q&A, it's about, is there a survey determining how older Americans view Biden, given the focus on his age and cognitive ability? Sunita, as far as I can tell, that hasn't happened yet, but I can imagine that future survey, if you're asking just about the general electorate, that we will start seeing those questions come up. We at API Data are already thinking ahead to the fall about some potential surveys that we may partner with others on, and it is now newsworthy given the kinds of questions that have emerged during the first presidential debate.
Thank you.
And then Carrie, she has a question. Are we able to get any information on the class income breakdowns from respondents?
Yes, if you go to the API Data website, you'll see respondent characteristics. I mean, these are weighted estimates, so we've weighted according to the factors that I've talked about, and so you'll see the income breakdown once we apply the weights to this survey. So yeah, go to our website and download the crosstabs, and you'll see that.
Great. Any other questions?
I saw a question that Randall Yip asked about Chinese and are they leaning more right? And it's a complicated answer, because I think on the one hand, we see that, we're not seeing a wholesale movement to Trump. We're not seeing that Chinese are more Republican than they are Democratic right now. And at the same time, they've also been one of the more conservative groups on many policies for a couple of rounds of this survey. But one of the things that I think is really interesting is that, there's lots of surveys conducted by many other people that suggest that Chinese in particular blame Trump for inciting anti-Chinese sentiment, and yet we're not seeing we're seeing like very, very small gains in support for Trump election over election. It's not dramatic. It's not the kind of huge swing that sometimes media says it is, but I do think that's an interesting pattern.
Yes.
I would also want to add that what we've seen is that also Chinese Americans, especially in the South, where there's legislation being presented around alien land laws, Chinese Americans, especially first-time voters, immigrant voters, are organizing around that in between elections. And so they are very much aware that they need to organize around this election, and they're keeping that in mind as they're going to the polls.
I also see one question from Quinn Din in the chat in terms of, is this analysis broken down by age group, and did any large variations by age emerge for any of the other questions asked? Excellent question, Quinn. You can find those in our crosstabs on our website, and that's for the Asian American population overall. If anyone's interested in a particular group, say for example the Vietnamese American population and how age might matter, please get in touch with APIA Data and we will run that custom analysis. Know, however, that the margins of errors will go up even higher when we do those age breakdowns or say nativity breakdowns within any of those groups. But I know that especially in the Vietnamese American population, that's been a big and ongoing interest, is to understand the generational divides by nativity as well as by age and how those play out. So thank you for that question and that suggestion. I also see Christine, just by Paul Watanabe, question about, are there specific close races in the House where the Asian American vote might matter? If you go to API Data to our blog, you'll see a list of Senate and House races where the Asian American eligible voter population is significant and larger than the anticipated margin of victory or defeat. And the short answer is yes, there are many House races where the Asian American and Pacific Islander vote will make a difference this year.
Yeah, and I would like to also add that from our analysis, what we've also seen is that, especially in battleground states, there's been an increase of the API population. And also when you're looking at those who are 18 and older and who are citizens, that number has actually jumped incredibly larger than the margin of victory back in 2020. So we are going to be looking at that, and also our partners who are actually doing the mobilization on the ground are very much keeping that in mind of engaging this new base of new potential voters. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Belle for a live question.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. The data is excellent, and I think that we need to share that very widely. John, one of the chart that you showed in your presentation was specifically about the ethnic social media, the WeChat platforms, the WeChat, the WhatsApp, the Kakao, and so forth. To what extent? I don't know whether anything was done during the survey or the analysis, but to what extent are those platforms influencing the opinion and decision of the people that you're surveying?
I don't think the survey methodology probably can't detect that, but I think it is fair to say that there's no question that these platforms are being used by groups to inform each other, right? And I say that in the informed general sense because that information can be both good and bad. And that's where I think all of our organizations have been working in different ways to identify where there is misinformation, disinformation, work with organizations and organizers on the ground to provide what one might be called inoculation materials or to correct the record. And also do that in a sort of both a linguistically and culturally appropriate way. right? Because again, here I'm going to speak directly about the Chinese American population, which I'm most familiar with, is how you talk to a first generation Chinese American population that is business oriented is going to look different than how you would talk to a sort of a native born Chinese population from Chinatown. And so I think all of us are developing some pretty localized strategies around that, but that's definitely high on our minds going to the election season.
Thank you, John. Can I have just one quick follow-on question?
Real quickly.
Okay, that's all right. You all know I've been talking about this issue for quite a long time now, and I just want to know, are the various organizations like AAJC and other and APIAVote for also, are you all developing some strategies that you can share? Maybe not in this chat, but perhaps offline.
Yeah, probably we could talk offline because, like, again, like here, sort of, we are working for AAJC. Our model is to identify trends of misinformation, disinformation, identify what the source is, where it's coming from, and then work with local groups, whether it's, well, even groups like CAA, Chinese for Affirmative Action, or Viet Fact Check, or, you know, groups like that, because they're going to be in the best position to do the inoculation work. So there is a network, an ecosystem that I think all of us have developed together to help address that.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll just say quickly, and I know we're running out of time, it's important to resource these efforts, right? And that's critical. You see the kind of attention being paid for mainstream, mechanisms of disinformation and misinformation, really just false and bad information, right? This does not need to be partisan here. It can happen on any aspect of ideology. And unfortunately, our communities do not get the kinds of investments. They don't get the kind of outreach investments. They don't get the kind of investments in combating misinformation, disinformation, as you see in the general public. So that's an area of concern. There's another question in the Q&A about Israel-Gaza. Randall, thank you for that question. In this survey, as well as in prior surveys, we don't see any indication that this is a top issue, but we do see that among younger voters, it might make a difference with respect to their turnout. And that very well might be important in states like Michigan, for example, where you have a significant Asian American population, but also an Arab American population that is quite frustrated with the Biden administration's handling of Israel-Gaza. So it likely will make a difference, but then you also have other issues like abortion, environment, and gun control, including among younger voters, that might tip the balance the other way. This is what will make it both uncertain and exciting and maybe nail-biting for a lot of people between now and November.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I just want to reiterate, also going back to Bell, where APIAVote, we are working with our local partners. We are currently in the process of trying to fundraise to be able to build up the capacity of our local partners to fight mis and disinformation. But we are doing regular reports and analyzing what are the trends that we're seeing in conjunction with partners like CAA, Advancing Justice, AAJC, and a wide variety of other groups. So with that, it is 2 o'clock, and so we would like to once again thank Asian American Advancing Justice, AAJC, API Data, and AARP for their partnership in this Asian American Voter Survey. As a reminder, this recording will be provided to everyone and uploaded to the various websites of these organizations, as well as the final report and the crosstabs. So for those who are interested in really digging deep into the data, we look forward to providing you with that. And once again, please do reach out if you have further questions. And thank you once again for joining us today.